In the dark streets of 1980s Los Angeles, a shadow lurked, a figure who moved silently through the night, leaving behind a trail of terror and death. He was a predator with a thirst for blood, a man who would become known as the Night Stalker. His real name, Richard Ramirez. Tonight, we delve into the twisted mind and horrific crimes of one of America's most notorious serial killers, exploring the events that shaped his path to darkness and the legacy of fear he left in his wake. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror began in 1984, but his story starts much earlier, in a small town far from the bustling streets of LA. Born in El Paso, Texas, on February 29, 1960, Richard was the youngest of 5 children in a household marked by instability and violence. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a former policeman turned laborer, a man with a temper as fiery as the desert sun. This volatile environment would be one of the first steps in Richard's journey down a dark path. Richard's upbringing was anything but ordinary. As a child, he was exposed to disturbing influences that would later shape his psyche. One of the most significant was his cousin, Miguel Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran who had witnessed and committed unspeakable acts during his service. Miguel took a twisted pleasure in sharing these experiences with young Richard, showing him photographs of the atrocities he had committed, photos that depicted torture, mutilation, and death. This exposure to violence and death at such a young age had a profound impact on Richard, warping his understanding of right and wrong. It was as if a seed of evil had been planted in his mind, one that would eventually grow into a monstrous obsession with death and suffering. By his teenage years, Richard was already on a dangerous trajectory. He began using drugs, turning to LSD and marijuana to escape the chaos of his life. These substances further eroded his sense of reality, blurring the line between the horrors in his mind and the world around him. His fascination with the macabre deepened, and he began to dabble in Satanism, finding a dark allure in the rituals and symbols associated with the occult. In 1984, Richard Ramirez would cross a line from which there was no return. His first known victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, an elderly woman living alone in her Los Angeles apartment. Richard broke into her home in the dead of night, stabbing her repeatedly before sexually assaulting her lifeless body. This brutal act marked the beginning of his year-long spree of terror, a spree that would claim the lives of at least 13 people. As the months passed, the Night Stalker's attacks grew more frequent and more brutal. He struck at random, targeting men, women, and even children. His victims ranged in age from a 9-year-old girl to an 84-year-old man, and the randomness of his crimes made him all the more terrifying. No one knew who he was, where he would strike next, or why he was driven to such evil. The city of Los Angeles was gripped by fear, with residents locking their doors and windows, terrified of the shadow that stalked the night. The police were desperate to catch the Night Stalker, but he was elusive, leaving few clues behind. He was a master of stealth, slipping in and out of homes like a ghost, leaving only horror in his wake. Despite their best efforts, the authorities were always one step behind, and the body count continued to rise. But Richard Ramirez was not invincible. In August 1985, he made a critical mistake that would lead to his downfall. After a failed attack, his car was spotted, and fingerprints were found on the vehicle. Forensic analysis quickly matched these prints to Richard Ramirez, a man with a history of petty crimes. The Night Stalker had finally been identified. On August 31, 1985, Richard Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles by a group of brave citizens. Recognizing him from the media coverage, they chased him down, eventually cornering him. It was a moment of poetic justice. Ramirez, who had brought so much terror to the city, was now at the mercy of the very people he had terrorized. They held him until the police arrived, and with that, the reign of the Night Stalker was over. Richard Ramirez's trial was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the nation. Throughout the proceedings, he showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he reveled in the notoriety, taunting the court and the victims' families with his dark, twisted persona. At one point, he even flashed a pentagram he had drawn on his hand, proclaiming his allegiance to Satan. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, along with multiple counts of sexual assault, burglary, and other crimes. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison to await his execution. Yet, despite the conviction, the specter of the Night Stalker continued to haunt the public consciousness. The sheer brutality of his crimes and the randomness of his attacks left a scar on the city of Los Angeles, one that would not soon heal. Richard Ramirez's story is one of horror and tragedy, a tale of how a man, shaped by a lifetime of abuse, violence, and dark influences, could descend into unimaginable darkness. While justice was ultimately served, the scars he left on the city, and on the families of his victims, remain. The Night Stalker's name will forever haunt the annals of true crime history, a dark reminder of the evil that once lurked in the shadows of Los Angeles. This was the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, a man who embodied the darkest corners of the human soul. May we never forget the victims whose lives were tragically cut short by his hands, and may their memories serve as a beacon of light in the face of such darkness. Thank you for listening, and until next time, stay safe.